This last part of our lecture will look at what anthropologists or how anthropologists know what they know. Anthropology employs a wide variety of methodologies, or what we call systematic strategies, for collecting and analyzing data. This does include at least part in the scientific method, right? The goal of the scientific method is to develop, test, and disprove hypotheses. And so we use a theoretical framework to conduct the scientific method. You guys all probably did at least 1 year of science fair projects in your elementary or middle or high school education, right? I personally, even as a science teacher, hate the science fair. I think the worst way to get kids to participate in science is to mandate it. And a lot of the stuff that people are interested in doesn't necessarily lend itself to developing an experiment. And the thing that drives me crazy about the science fair is that people go to websites like Science Buddies and they just do the same thing that's been done every single time. Like, the human like psychology one where you have words and you're asking people to read the words, but you change the color of the text and they have to say what the word says, not what the color of the text is, right? The Stroop effect. I don't remember what that one's called, but it gets really boring to have the same projects done over and over again, proving or disproving the same things over and over again. So, how do we apply the scientific method in anthropology? A lot of what we talk about in cultural anthropology, at least, involves perceptions and identities. That's not something you can scientifically test, right? Asking people how they feel about things. I mean, there's some ways of quantifying that, but it's a much more what I would call a touchy-feely basis for your conclusions. So the scientific method is incredibly strong, and there are aspects of anthropology that are quote unquote science. But there are also aspects of anthropology that are more what we would consider a social science or a humanity. So, we just have to recognize that evolutionary anthropology is very, very rooted in the scientific method. Archaeology as well, very rooted in the scientific method. Cultural and linguistic anthropology, less so. So we'll talk about some specific methodologies as we go through the summer term, or as we go through this term. We'll talk about particular methodologies that are unique, perhaps, to cultural anthropology. Um, Science or disciplines can also be broken up into what we consider qualitative and quantitative. Some anthropologists use quantitative methods, which involves putting numbers to things, right? This classifies features of a phenomenon through a count or a measure, and then constructs mathematical and statistical models to explain what is observed. Okay, statistical models have their place. It's great to be able to say something like 50% of all marriages end in divorce, right? We understand statistics. We understand what that means, but do we really? I like to use this divorce statistic as a case in point, right? If I were to tell you that 50% of marriages end in divorce, would you be super excited about going to the altar with your partner, right? Probably not, because we could just take a quarter up to the altar with us and flip it, and if it's heads, we stay married. If it's tails, we're going to get divorced. So it's kind of like, what's the point of even getting married? Well, that statistic is misleading because that's looking at all marriages. And in fact, if we just look at first time marriages, only 20% of those end in divorce, 80% of those succeed for the long term. So, what's responsible for that discrepancy in those statistics? It's that once you've divorced once, you become more likely to divorce again. So, we get what we call self selection into the divorcing kind of category. So, statistics are not all that there is, right? They're important, they form policy. But those of us who work in education recognize that state standardized testing, right? That doesn't really work in a classroom. That doesn't really work to predict success in life, based on something like the SAT or the ACT or even the AccuPlacer, right? So there is strength in quantitative testing. In cultural anthropology, we use a lot of what we call qualitative testing. Qualitative methods aim to produce an in-depth and detailed description of social behaviors and beliefs. There is a hallmark of cultural anthropology and kind of its legacy, and that is something called ethnography. The ethnographic method, which involves prolonged and intense observation of and participation in the life of a community, is the hallmark of cultural anthropology. What people used to do historically was write ethnographies. So there's Margaret Mead, who worked in American Samoa, right? She wrote an ethnography of American Samoa. She lived with that one population and wrote a book that summarized all of her observations over many, many years of living in American Samoa. Um, there was value in that, right? But this is that salvage anthropology. This is like basically that way of quantifying what uh, life was like for a population prior to globalization, prior to the immense amount of change that comes from entering into this global community. And there's a string of ethnographic techniques that we will talk about. There's participant observation, embedding yourself in that society and engaging in the customs, the economics of really everything that characterizes life in that society. That is really, really valuable. Gives you a great perspective. However, it also makes you perhaps less able to see that culture as outsiders see that culture, right? It gives you this unique kind of loyalty and sense of community with the people you study, but then you might not recognize your innate biases that come from participating in that culture, but having a position of privilege, right? So there are some drawbacks to applying ethnographic techniques. There's interviews. Well, interviews can be very structured and you can ask everybody the same questions. That's great. But sometimes the interesting stuff comes from observation, not what you're actually questioning. So we will go through the ethnographic methods in depth and talk about how they've been applied historically and also how they're applied with modern anthropology. But it used to be that anthropology was the only discipline that practiced ethnography. Well, now sociologists are using ethnographic techniques to practice sociology. So, just know where it came from and what its value is, but also recognize sometimes what the limitations can be. Another very useful framework for making qualitative observations about a society is what we call the comparative method, right? This can involve ethnocentrism. You could compare the culture that you're studying to your own. But from a scientific perspective and using that to really understand people's identities, that may not be the bad thing as like policy being based on ethnocentrism. So being able to compare things is incredibly useful. And more, it's not enough in cultural anthropology to simply write an ethnography. There are really no populations that are completely what we call uncontacted. There's this myth of the uncontacted human population, right? The group that has never had any contact with the outside world, never been studied. We talk about, oh, there's uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, etc. The myth of that is this idea that they are completely remote and separate from everybody around them. When we say uncontacted tribes, we're basically talking about tribes that have not been contacted by white Western anthropologists. They've not been quote unquote studied. That doesn't mean that local populations don't interact with them. Some of these mythically uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, for example, have metal pots and pans. Okay, they didn't independently or invent metallurgy. They're not smelting their own metals. Instead, they're trading with populations with which they do have contact. So, we don't have any. That idea of the noble savage is one you really need to just shuck right out of your head, right? We don't have these mythical, never before been exposed to principles from the outside world populations that we can study that are pristine and just as they have been for like thousands of years. Anthropology has definitely over the past decade or two moved to what's called problems oriented research. So instead of just going and living with one particular population for years and embedding yourself in their society, you're asking a question about a particular population. You're picking your populations based on the value of the comparison that you could make. So let's say you want to study transgender identity politics. Well, you might compare between urban American populations and populations in Oaxaca, in Mexico. In Oaxaca, there is, I'm going to mispronounce the term. I apologize in advance, but there is a term for people who are, it's mujes, Muxes. These are biological men that present as women and perform specific functions in rural Oaxacan society. Very different though than like RuPaul's Drag Race, right? Than the idea of drag queen story time at the main library site in Albuquerque. So the you pick in problems oriented research, you're making choices informed by kind of an underlying understanding of what an ethnography of that population already holds, right? You're using what anthropologists who've come before you have documented about particular occurrences, particular cultural features, particular behaviors in particular societies to basically pick where you want to make your comparisons, because the real lived experience of a transgender woman in Albuquerque is going to be different than Mujer in Oaxaca, right? There's no way to get around that. Our society is different, our culture is different. All right, so I'm not going to take a break here because we've only had like 3 slides, and I'd like to finish the lecture and take a break at the end then. So thinking critically about anthropology here, how might you use a comparative perspective even if you only visit one country while on a vacation? Well, I mean, obviously you're going to compare it to what you know from your own country, right? But are there comparisons that we can make within one country? That is, maybe challenge yourself to think, do the wealthy, do the landowners, do the people who own property act in the same way as the people who are homeless, right? Or as the people who own no property and are forced to do like migrant labor, right? Is the experience of people in cities going to be the same as the experience of people in rural populations? Is this experience of or your interaction with people who speak English going to be the same as your interaction with people who have no knowledge of English? Consider the other cultural contexts that you've experienced and how these might provide a comparative framework for experiencing a novel society. Can you then also encourage your peers or students to think about their identities with a comparative perspective? I'm going to try a new project with my biology students in the upcoming school year where they have to, it's going to be like alien observations. And they're going to have to look at stuff on another planet, obviously fictional, right? To determine whether those items, those substances, etc., are living or non-living. And so it's going to really summarize this unit of what is life, how do we tell when things are living versus non-living. If I were to give you a water sample from the Bosque, for example, right, is river water living or non-living? Well, you can't just simply make that answer because there are aspects of it, the water itself, that are non-living. However, there's microscopic life thriving in river water. So how do we encourage people to think about themselves and their culture with a comparative perspective? We can make comparisons in Albuquerque, right? Anglos versus Hispanics versus Native Americans, people who have lived in New Mexico their whole lives versus people who moved to New Mexico from another state. In Albuquerque, people who grew up in Albuquerque versus those who are recent immigrants from a more rural area of New Mexico, right? Northern New Mexico versus Southern New Mexico, et cetera. We can make comparative uh, observations, even within our own relatively limited, in diversity culture, right? All right, so then our last topic is how do we put our knowledge to work in the world? There's a branch of anthropological thinking called applied anthropology, and this is really looking at practical applications. These practical applications are so important that some anthropologists consider applied anthropology the fifth subfield. So anthropological thinking can inform a lot of different disciplines. There are jobs with non-governmental organizations, for example, NGOs, aid organizations, that can be really important. If we want to develop health programs in some place like Kenya, or we want to develop health programs among the Chamane of Bolivia, or something, we've got to have a knowledge of their culture and kind of how they identify themselves, but also their relative place in the world, right? We can't simply, even with the Navajo, we can't simply bring in COVID-19 testing and expect the testing to change the pattern of contagion, right? We have to have a good working knowledge of the challenges that the Navajo face. I mean, many people who live on the Navajo reservation don't have access to electricity or running water. Okay, now tell me how you're supposed to wash your hands thoroughly for 20 seconds at a time after every possible exposure if you don't have running water, right? So understanding those distinct challenges. Applied archaeology on the Navajo reservation. We're able to apply anthropological thinking to how we excavate and what we do with the material remains that we excavate. The naturalness of co-sleeping. If you read anything about early infant care in the Western world, right, you're not supposed to bed share, but we've bed shared as people for millions of years. So it is natural for mothers and their babies to sleep together. And in all honesty, it's not generally that mother-baby relationship that influences whether babies suffocate or not. That is often at the hands of someone else who's in the bed, either another child or the father. Um, but it's also a function of thick mattresses, pillow top mattresses with lots of covers, right? It's also a function of the lifestyle choices that people make, like drug use, alcohol use, obesity, smoking, etc. So, simply to say that co-sleeping is unnatural or bad for babies doesn't really get at the underlying kind of importance and good things that can happen with well-informed, safely practiced co-sleeping. Supporting the sustainability of endangered languages in Arizona, right? We've got endangered languages close to us. The reason that Navajo was used as a language of code talkers in World War II was because it wasn't a written language at that time. It was only passed on through oral traditions. And so, if a language is not written down, how do people study it, right? Well, now, if you take Navajo as a foreign language at CNM, there's a Navajo textbook. So there's been some change in how the language is communicated and passed on, just even in like the last 50, 60 years. So, when you take someone's language, you take away their culture, you erase their culture. We have a history in New Mexico and really in the United States as a whole of Indian schools where students were removed, children were removed from the reservation in order to learn how to be more white or more Western at these Indian schools here. Their hair was cut. They weren't allowed to speak their native languages. They weren't allowed to wear traditional dress. Their culture was erased from them. This is something called ethnocide, where you work really hard to erase a person's cultural identity. We're still on the reservations dealing with the repercussions of that. There were a number of native languages that were almost lost through this process of Indian schools, a lot of cultural practice that were almost lost. So, yet again, taking a moment to think about things. How might an anthropologist and an engineer approach a problem involving where to situate a bridge or a highway in a heavily populated area, right? An engineer is probably going to look at structural soundness and make an opinion as to where to put the bridge based on um, the easiest place to build it or the place where it's going to be the most structurally sound or the way that it's going to influence traffic patterns, etc. An anthropologist will be able to look at land use and figure out a way that maximizes the bridge's accessibility to all the populations in this densely populated area that use that land. So anthropology applies to a multitude of disciplines, and having an anthropological framework in the way in which you view the world goes pretty far in helping you make wise, well thought out, well guided choices. All right, so lastly, we will talk about ethics. Anthropologists have ethical obligations. Ethics are organically connected to what it means to be a good anthropologist. If you're going to embed yourself with a population, if you're going to engage in participant observation, you are going to develop a unique obligation to the people, to the land, to the societies that you study. And so the primary ethical responsibility of anthropologists is to the people, species, or artifacts they study, not to the government that they come from or even the government in the country that they're studying, right? Many modern anthropologists assert that they're ethically obligated to go beyond what's called do no harm. The American Association of Anthropology, or of Anthropologists, focuses on this do no harm. Don't do anything that's going to bring a negative outcome for the people that you study, but we're really obligated to do good for the communities. That's a step beyond do no harm. This is especially true when you work with marginalized or powerless communities. And so one of the ways that this has manifested itself with the Chimane of Bolivia, there's been a health and wellness study that's been done with the Chimane that's been active for the last kind of 15 years, 10 to 15 years, where anthropologists from both UNM and UC Santa Barbara have been working with the Chimane, who are horticulturalists in Bolivia. And as part of this, they've brought medical care to the communities that were really relatively isolated. And as part of their not only do no harm, but taking it a step beyond to do good, one of the things that can happen when you're doing health and wellness kind of studies in an indigenous population is that these individuals have access to medicine for the time that the anthropologists are there. But once the anthropologists leave, guess what? Their access to medical treatment and care leaves with the Western anthropologists. And so to do good in this situation, the people who've run the study Hillary Kaplan, Mike Gervin, they have trained Chimane people to be medical technicians and to provide kind of routine access to care, but they've also contracted with doctors from neighboring communities to set up a kind of rotation system whereby a couple of times a year these doctors travel to Chimane villages to provide kind of ongoing treatment. So the health technicians that have been trained kind of serve as physician's assistants and can do things, herbal things, work with some medicines to provide kind of routine preventative health care to these communities. And then the doctors that come through are able to provide emergency care, are able to treat more difficult cases, are able to also bring with them resupply the medicinal stocks, etc. So it's really been a good program. You don't just come in and bring medicine while you're studying them, but you leave a system in place that allows them to continue to have access to medical care once you as an anthropologist leave. So there's some real value in this obligation to do good. Is this really any different than educators' obligations to their student populations? This is a little way of thinking about it for those of you in the teacher education track, but who's your obligation to? Your school? Your students? The PED, the Department of Public Education? It's to all of those things, but first and foremost, our students. So I've got students who are homeless right now, and that brings special kinds of challenges in delivering remote education during the school closures because of COVID, right? It's one thing to think about, well, how are we going to bring education to students who don't have a device? But what if you don't just not have a device, you also don't have Wi-Fi, you also don't have a place to live, right? So our obligation as educators has to first and foremost be to our students, more so than even to our school or to national standards or whatever that kind of overarching thing is. And so our last thinking critically, if you were going to study a local Head Start program that has few resources and observe problems with local funding for the facility, what kind of action projects, action anthropology, applied anthropology might you suggest to help the organization? One of those is going to be reach out and incorporate your community into your Head Start program, right? How do we get the local people involved? Perhaps we draw our student population from the local population. Perhaps we work with local business owners and get them to support the Head Start program. Perhaps we work up some way of having intern early childhood educators from that local population, right? There are ways in which we work to build community that are going to help to build funding for things that are embedded in that community. And it's really important that we as anthropologists impart those skills to people who are going to go into a wide variety of careers, right? That is really the value of academic anthropology. It's not coming up with some new explanation for slang among teenagers in Albuquerque in 2020, right? It's giving our student population the anthropological tools that they're going to be able to take with them into whatever their chosen career pathway is, whether it's education or whether it's engineering, right? To be able to serve the communities that they serve in a way that acknowledges and recognizes the cultural realities of those communities with which they work.